Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope you're well. It's very grey outside. I don't have a lot of preamble this week. I want to get straight into the story because what I want to talk about sort of outside of the book a little bit is this mysterious incident at the end where Oliver sees Fagin and monks outside his window in the country, and our friend John Sutherland has something to say about that. So I'm going to wait until then to sort of step outside the book a little bit. Somebody very astutely made the comment very early in this book that it's kind of surprising that they made such a happy musical about this book. And I was thinking about that because, if you go back and look, I mean, I loved the movie, but it is, I don't believe anything like that could be made today because it does make Fagin and his gang seem like, a lovely, happy little micro family and a merry band. And it sort of downplays the prostitution and the lack of agency. And as I said, Dickensian London looks absolutely clean in the 1968 movie version. So, I don't think it will be made today, but I think I had mentioned this before. For those of you who read Great Expectations with me, I believe there is a new adaptation of Great Expectations coming out, hopefully next year, by the British team who made Peaky Blinders. So I hope that gets to the screens. You never know now with the coronavirus, but I hope it gets to the screens and I hope it's good. I think it's meant to be a mini-series, so that's Great Expectations. But Oliver Twist, not so happy. And this next bit that we're going to read doesn't even come into the movie. Obviously, they would have had to make that movie about 4 hours long to include everything. So we left it with this bungled burglary attempt. Bill Sikes using Oliver, because he was such a small boy, to get through a small window into this house in Chertsey, where there was, this sort of quantity, particularly of plate, silver plate, and the sort of the butler of the house, Giles, who's the man of, bit of a man of all work, hears them come in and shoots, and he shoots Oliver. And Bill Sikes and Toby Crackett try and drag Oliver away. But, the last we hear of Oliver is not good. And the chapter we ended with is Fagin getting the news. And that chapter ended with the Jew stopped to hear no more, but uttering a loud yell, and twining his hands in his hair, rushed from the room and from the house. So Fagin's just heard that they don't know where Oliver is. Excuse me. The news last night did warn that seasonal allergies might be high again today. So we're left with Fagin rushing out of the room. And we know that this is not care and concern for the boy as much as it is Fagin. First of all, if the boy is dead, there would have been an investigation. We see later in this section the police coming to investigate the robbery, and even although Oliver had no status and no stature at this time, they did take death seriously, and somebody particularly being shot would have been investigated. So clearly Fagin doesn't want that to come out, doesn't want anything to come back to him. And secondly, he feels he's lost, this kind of potential revenue from the future. He's going to make Oliver into a great thief. So this is the bit where we start this week. Fagin, we follow Fagin. Now, don't forget, for the readers of this who are waiting from week to week, Dickens is prolonging the suspense, because the next chapter we don't go back to what happened to Oliver. we're now following Fagin, and we're following Fagin into this kind of, warren of these little streets. And we see sort of Louise Howell asked the chapter 36, in which a mysterious character appears upon the scene, and many things inseparable from this history are done and performed. So I hope that clears it up. That's where we are. And it is important to think about the chapter headings, because it doesn't become clear to us for quite a while why this chapter is inseparable from the history. It will become clear, but Dickens is kind of teasing a few things now. First of all, we get this mysterious monks, and he's also distancing us from, what's happening to Oliver. So the suspense, this poor little boy. Again, we're, getting close to 2/3 of the way through the book, but, and the book is called Oliver Twist, so I think we have to assume he's not dead, but we're in a certain amount of suspense at this point as to what's happening to him. Sorry, my UPS man is just delivering to. Everybody sees me sitting here at the window. I think they can just get on. I'm relieved he didn't ask for a signature. Anyway, so Fagin goes wandering off into the depths of London. And incidentally, by the way, we see now, he takes us past, the people who are selling all his handkerchiefs. We had that at the beginning. Remember when Oliver is caught and he goes to meet Fagin for the first time, Dodger takes him back there, and Oliver sees all these handkerchiefs, these silk handkerchiefs, and he's, what are they all for the laundry? And they all kind of laugh, how naive Oliver is. And now we see that, Fagin is essentially passing these on to be sold. So if you wanted a silk handkerchief at a discount, you went into this part of London and didn't ask too closely about where it came from. So there's this whole section about the the sort of the underworld of London, if you like, with the people in the bars, the pubs, and just the very full description about all these people. I think, Dickens did walk the streets at night, and he did go into a lot of these places. He said he never really sort of felt threatened there. I think people regarded him as very much, a sort of benevolent type if they knew him at all. And if they didn't, maybe he was just imposing enough for them not to bother him. But but all this would have been incredibly new and interesting to his audience, who'd maybe heard things about, various parts of London that they should not venture into, but they didn't really know what was there. There were newspaper reports, of course, but Dickens is one of the first novelists, this is quite early, to give everybody a real insight into what was happening, what kind of people were there. And again, a lot of it is somewhat muted. He doesn't talk so openly about the prostitution because he really couldn't in a book that was going to be published. But astute readers would have seen through the lines and realized that that's what was happening. So this whole section of Fagin going wandering in to the sort of the London, you say the London Underground, it sounds like the subway, but I really mean that sort of criminal underworld, if you like. And he Fagin goes in and he asks for monks. But even as the landlord of the pub says the name, the Jew says yes, hush. And so there's something mysterious about the man's name. Just Fagin doesn't even want to have it said aloud. So there's mystery about who this man is. What is he doing in this part of the book? And why doesn't Fagin even want his criminal contemporaries to know, that he's looking for him. So a lot of mystery. And then
you have a question. What they're asking, what is the name of the chapter?
Yeah, I did say that. I gave it out.
Okay, Miss.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah, if you did not hear that, I did give it out. It is chapter 36, in which a mysterious character appears upon the scene, and many things inseparable from this history are done and performed. Okay. So Fagin goes to Bill Sikes' house. Bill is not there, but Nancy is there, and we find out that Nancy is drunk. As I said last time, we have this tremendous sympathy and empathy probably for Nancy. I mean, this poor young girl, we're not quite sure how old she is, but she's possibly in her late teens, who knows? And, you know, she's been really trapped into this life of degradation and prostitution. A lot of Dickens audiences would not have seen her that way. They would have seen her as, well, you know, this is she's getting what she deserves because she's, you know, naturally a criminal, or naturally she too lazy not to be poor. We have a much different understanding in this day and age of the causes of poverty, but the fact that she is, you know, hopelessly drunk here would have sunk her in the eyes of Dickens readers even further. And I think it's important to bear that in mind for what comes later. And so Fagin says to her in this part, you know, where's Bill, where's Oliver? And you know, Nancy is just she's drunk, she doesn't know, and I think we can take from this as well that Nancy is probably got some deep regret about her part in all this, and taking Oliver from the Brownlows and giving him back to Bill Sikes and Fagin. And again, Dickens' audience at this point would have been, well, you know, you deserve your misery for doing that, not really thinking about the fact that she felt she didn't have a lot of choice, and that if she had not taken Oliver, she would have been killed by Bill Sikes. So again, it's just going to sort of sink Nancy as well. You see, she had the opportunity to do good, and she didn't. So let her wallow in her misery. We, I think, see her in a little more sympathetic light. And then we have this conversation with Monks. The mysterious Monks comes to Fagin's house. And this is, you know, again, he's really shrouded in mystery to a huge extent, because we know the only people in Fagin's house right now are, you know, his boys. They're not going to tell anybody. And Fagin won't even put on a light for Monks. They sit there with a candle, you know, sort of at the opposite side of out in the hallway while they're in the room. And they have this conversation about Oliver, and Fagin says, you know, he's so valuable to me, I want him back. And that's kind of the conversation they have. And the conversation comes to an end when Monks suddenly gets to his feet. This is almost at the end of this chapter. And Monks jumps up and he says, I saw the shadow of a woman in a cloak and bonnet pass along the wainscot like a breath. The Jew released his hold. He's jumped up and grabbed hold of Monks, and they rushed tumultuously from the room. The candle, wasted by the draught, was standing where it had been placed. It showed them only the empty staircase and their own white faces. They listened intently, but a profound silence reigned throughout the house. "It's your fancy," said the Jew, taking up the light and turning to his companion. "I'll swear I saw it," replied Monks, trembling. "It was bending forward when I saw it first, and when I spoke, it darted away." The Jew glanced contemptuously at the pale face of his associate, and telling him he could follow if he pleased, ascended the stairs. They looked in all the rooms. They were cold, bare, and empty. They descended to the passage and thence into the cellars below. The green damp hung upon the low walls, and the tracks of the snail and slug glistened in the light of the candle, but all was still as death. So we have this mysterious sort of little incident here, which in some ways foreshadows this dreamlike sequence we have with Oliver at the end, and perhaps events towards the end of the book there, without giving away too many spoilers. So I'm going to pause there. I see we have some questions. I'm sorry, yes, it is chapter 26, not 36. I did misspeak. Thank you. So David asks, why is Fagin so fixated on Oliver? I think he thinks Oliver can make his fortune by becoming a good thief. I think maybe there's a shadow of male prostitution here. Dickens could not even remotely have published that. But we hear about, Oliver's angelic good looks. And I think Fagin is certainly not going to shy away from that kind of sort of criminal enterprise. So I think just because his face is so angelic, I think Fagin believes that if he trains Oliver into being a good thief, that nobody would ever believe him. I mean, if you think about that scene where he goes out with the Dodger and Charlie Bates, the only reason Oliver gets chased by Mr. Brownlow and the bookstore owner is because Oliver runs. I think Fagin believes that Oliver's, sort of angelic, innocent countenance would be a tremendous asset in his business. And again, there might be the whisper of, male prostitution, but that's not something that Dickens could state explicitly. David also asked, what's the population of London at this time? I think it's a couple of million. I'd have to look it up. I really would. I think I had some figures from before, from this first chapter. No, I'd have to look it up. But, as I said in that first chapter when we talked about the poor law, a lot of people who'd been living next to where they worked, servants, outdoor servants, by which I mean servants who didn't live in with their families, had been sort of cleared out of the area to sort of make way for bigger houses and nicer streets and other things. And there was no public transportation available, or not reliably so. So people who worked in London had to live within working distance. So it made the available sort of pool of housing to them very, very small indeed. And it was, although parts of London were very nice and airy, and the streets were wide and there were gardens and parks and big houses, the working population was squeezed more and more into a small area because they had to be within walking distance of where they worked. So although London itself may have not been overpopulated, the number of people concentrated into those small areas was intense. Donna asks, any significance of the name Monks, any symbolic value in the naming of the character? The thing I thought about because I thought about this too, when I thought about, is there a symbolism to the name Monks, came up in that little section where Fagin goes into the pub looking for him, and he says, don't even speak his name. It's like there's a vow of silence around his name. I didn't really think of anything else in relationship to monks. I mean, if anybody's got thoughts, I'd be delighted to hear them. But I did think about that mystery and silence around the character. So if we have any more, if not, we'll move on. So apologies again for my misspeak. We are in the 20s still. Chapter 27. Atones for the unpoliteness of a former chapter which deserted a lady most unceremoniously. So now we get to have a little bit of comedy with Mr. Bumble and Mrs. Corney. If you remember last time, Mr. Bumble was cozying up nicely to Mrs. Corney, and managing to slide his arm around her and sneak a kiss, and when all of that was going on, Mrs. Corney gets a call that she has to go attend to a dying woman in the workhouse, which is most unfortunate for Mrs. Corney at that time. And we get a little further, again, don't forget that if we are reading this in weekly installments, perhaps you open the magazine this week thinking, finally, I'll get to find out what happened to Oliver, and oh no, we're back with Mr. Bumble. And it is very funny, but he's prolonging the suspense. So Mrs. Corney is out of the room, and Mr. Bumble takes it upon himself to do a very thorough inventory of Mrs. Corney's belongings. He's trying to make it in his own mind whether it's worth marrying her, whether she's got enough money, whether the sugar tongs are really silver, or the milk pot is really silver, and what her clothing is like. And he goes through everything. He opens the drawers, he looks at her clothes, he finds this small padlock box which he can't open, but when shaken, gave a pleasant sound as of the chinking of coins. So he's, adding it all up in his own mind. Is this woman worth marrying? And of course, fortunately for him, he's kind of gone through everything, and he's not caught in the act. When Mrs. Corney comes back, he's too busy admiring, I think, the shape of his legs in his breeches. So don't forget, we said at the very beginning, Mr. Bumble is aptly named because he bumbles the English language. And when Mrs. Corney comes running back in, he says, "Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron. "What is this, ma'am? Has anything happened, ma'am? Pray answer me. I'm on." Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, "Broken bottles," which is lovely, because he's literally hopping up and down, trying to figure out what's going on. He eventually gets to calm her down. She tells him that something happened, but she says she can't tell him what happened. And so Mr. Bumble goes back to his courting of Mrs. Corney, if we will. And it comes out that the part of his courting is to tell her that the head of the workhouse is dying, which, would turn any lady's head, wouldn't it? Let's be honest, ladies. And he says, I could get that job, and I could marry you, and we could both live together. And so Mrs. Corney agrees. And he says, so what did happen tonight? And she says, I'll tell you after we're married. So he can't really get a straight answer out of Mrs. Corney, but that's all he'll be able to do for tonight. And he goes to visit Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry to ask for a coffin for the woman who died. And he comes across Noah Claypole and Charlotte, and she's feeding him oysters. Oysters were very cheap and plentiful at this time. It's funny how things kind of slip over in later years. To have a chicken was incredibly was a delicacy, because you had to have room for chickens, and they took a while to grow, but oysters you could go fishing for every morning, and they were there. And they did, even in those times, have the reputation of being an aphrodisiac. So that's why I think Dickens puts in that, Noah makes a move to kiss Charlotte. And, Mr. Bumblesdown, he gives them a lecture about immorality, which, he's just kissed Mrs. Corney. We know what's going on here. Mr. Bumble is, an old hypocrite, and it's silly. But, we do laugh at this, that he's giving Noah and Charlotte a lecture for... and there's something about the act of eating oysters too. I don't like them myself. And there's something about, there's a kind of like slurping of them, which suggests appetites, both physical appetite and sexual appetite. So I think, Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry are not at home. And Noah and Charlotte eating oysters there. Had Mr. Bumble not stumbled across them, who knows what would have happened to Noah and Charlotte that evening. Dickens steps back in at the very end of this chapter, the authorial voice. He says, we watch Mr. Bumble go home, and let us set on foot a few inquiries after young Oliver Twist and ascertain whether he still be lying in the ditch where Toby Crackit left him. So we are going to go back and pick up that threads. Kathy makes the point, I wonder if Monk's name is anti-Catholic. Is the implication that Catholic monks are likely to be hiding sexual vices? That's a very interesting point. It certainly could be anti-Catholic, and not just sort of sexual corruption, but financial corruption was something that was leveled at Catholics as it was against Jews. So thank you for that thought. I wonder if that's part of it too, that there was a certain anti-Catholicism about, as well as anti-Semitism. Okay, so the title of this chapter, chapter 28, looks after Oliver and proceeds with his adventures. Of course, is ironic because they do no such thing of looking after him. They actually just dump him in a ditch. And we pick up the story of immediately after the immediate aftermath of the robbery. It's like a flashback in a movie. We've gone backwards. So, when you think of movie flashbacks as being modern devices, remember, Dickens was doing this a long time before movies. So we have a flashback, and we find out that the two servants who are chasing them, Mr. Giles and Brittles. Brittles is kind of a funny name. I'm not even sure why. And we do find out that, he came apparently, Brittles, as a houseboy when he was very young, and he's now in his 30s and he's still the houseboy. So Brittles sounds like he's going to break at any point. But Brittles and Giles are basically frightened of running after Bill Sikes and Toby, and they kind of, they know that I think Bill Sikes has a gun, and they kind of dilly-dally just long enough for Sikes and everybody sort of put enough distance between them. But then Sikes is literally left, holding the baby, as it were, because he's got Oliver. Oliver has been shot. He's lost a lot of blood. He's very weak. And Bill finds it hard to keep on carrying Oliver and taking him. And, they are worried. Sikes and Crackit are very worried that he's going to squeal on them. So they basically dump him. So Crackit really is the one who persuades Sikes to dump Oliver, and says, look, he's probably going to die. Just leave him here, and better, take the chance on us getting away and him being alive than us not getting away because we stick with him. And so we're halfway through this chapter now, and we find out that Oliver is very much still alive. Morning drew on apace, the air became more sharp and piercing, as its first dull hue, the death of night rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. I think that's a lovely image, you know, the death of night rather than the birth of day. It adds to the gloom immeasurably in one sentence, because we feel like maybe it's, you know, a horrible grey morning like it was this morning. And it's raining and it's miserable. And Sykes did bandage up Oliver's arm as they were leaving. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side, and the bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture, and when he'd done so, he looked feebly around for help and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. So presumably by now, you know, we have Victorian ladies all over the country reading this book and sort of dabbing their eyes at this terrible picture of poor little Oliver. And, you know, he staggers on, he finds a way to start walking and to start looking for help. He doesn't want to die. And we go then, we leave Oliver for a moment and we go, again, it's very cinematic. We're taken from poor Oliver sort of stumbling and bumbling along to the nice cozy kitchen where Giles and Brittles are telling the other servants, the cook and the housemaid and the tinker there. The tinker was a general sort of repairman. And they're telling them this whole story. And of course, you know, they're making as much hay out of this story as they possibly can, because this must be the most exciting and dangerous thing that's happened to them probably ever in their lives. And, you know, just when they're telling this and talking about noises outside, this is when they hear Oliver. And Oliver has managed to stumble back to the house where he was shot, the house that he was being made to rob. And there are two ladies in the house, an older lady and a young lady. We find out their names, Mrs. Maylie and Rose, but at the moment they're just the young lady. And we find out that Giles tells the young lady that one of the robbers is here and he's hurt very badly. And the young lady, Rose, says, well, you can send for a doctor. And Giles says, don't you want to take a look at them? Don't you want to take a look at him first? And she says, no, I don't want to know anything about it. So we're left with Oliver, and is he going to be rescued? Is he going to be turned into the police? This is what would have occupied the minds of Dickens readers at the time. So we're on to chapter 29, which has an introductory account of the inmates of the house to which Oliver resorted. So we're going to find out a little bit more about Mrs. Maylie and Rose, and they are aunt and niece, we find out. And we find out that that Rose is, you know, this angel on earth, as far as we can tell. The description of her is, she was not past 17, cast in so slight and exquisite a mould, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not to her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eye and was stamped upon her noble head seemed scarcely of her age or of the world, and yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humor, the thousand lights that played about the face and left no shadow there, above all the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were made for home, for fireside peace and happiness. Note the capitalization of the word home. The domestic home was the center of all Victorian society, and there was no greater moral good to have than a good home with a good wife and mother and happy servants. And you know, of course, it's many cases a myth, but that was the domestic ideal. So we find out a bit more about them. Brittles has been sent off to fetch the doctor. And I love these little asides when we learn that he came as a houseboy and he's still the houseboy. And the lady of the house, Mrs. Maylie, says Brittles was, he's always slow. And Mr. Giles says, Brittles was always a slow boy, ma'am. And seeing by the by that Brittles had been a slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one. So we get a very accurate picture of Brittles summed up, I think. But again, we get this tremendous kindness in this house that without looking at him, they still don't know he's a little boy. They just know it's one of the robbers, or at least Mrs. Maylie and Rose don't know that he's a little boy. They send for the doctor. They're not, you know, willing to let him die just because. And obviously they've, you know, put up with Brittle's shortcomings, whatever those may be, for 30 odd years. So the doctor comes and Mr. Losburn, who's, you know, this, you know, he's also very kind and fat. There's a lot of fat men in this book. And the doctor says, you know, I guess you shot him, Giles. And Giles says, yes. And so, you know, the doctor goes up to see him. And he's gone a long time. And he eventually comes down and he says to Mrs. Maylie and Rose, do you want to see him? And they both sort of say no. And the doctor says, I think you should see him. But, you know, I'll be with you. It's okay. I'm not going to, you know, leave you there. And the doctor really presses the case at the very end of this chapter. He says, I think it necessary at all events. I'm quite sure that you would deeply regret not having done so if you postponed it. And so he takes them up to see this little boy. And this is at the beginning of chapter 30, relates what Oliver's new visitors thought of him. And we see they are expecting this kind of, they say in lieu of the dogged black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion and sunk into a deep sleep. His wounded arm, bound and splintered up, was crossed upon his breast. His head reclined upon the other arm, which was half hidden by its long hair as it streamed over the pillow. So we have this heart-rending picture. As I say, I think, you know, Mrs. Maylie and Rose were expecting to see this, this scoundrel, black-visaged ruffian. And they get this poor little child. So, of course, their hearts melt. And there is a little conversation there about, you know, he must have been forced into this. They can't believe that a child so innocent looking and so, you know, so just so young could do this. And so we hear the, you know, the kindness of their hearts here. And then Mrs. Maylie basically says, oh, you know, well, what are we going to do when the police come? Because, you know, I don't want to turn them in. there was no sort of provision for child offenders at this time. Had Oliver been turned in, he would have, just been treated like any other criminal, and the penalties were severe, and quite possibly he could have been hanged for it. Think back to the beginning of the workhouse book, the chapters about the workhouse, when the gentleman in the white waistcoat says, "I know he's going to be hanged. I know he's going to be hanged." It's not impossible. What did happen, and it prompted a lot of legal reform in the end, was what had always happened, where people were charged with crimes that were ridiculously severe, was that juries would refuse to convict. But it was a bit of a crapshoot. There are a lot of cases where juries would take pity on somebody and refuse to convict, but it didn't always happen. So Oliver would have been in a great deal of danger had Mrs. Maylie and Rose and the doctor particularly not decided to intervene and not turn him in. And so, they wait for Oliver to be awake before they decide anything and hear what he has to say. And Oliver finally wakes up and is able to give them, the full story of what's happened to him. Beginning of the paragraph, the conference was a long one. For Oliver told them all his simple history and was often compelled to stop by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing to hear in the darkened room, the feeble voice of the sick child recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh, if we, when oppress and grind our fellow creatures, we bestowed but one thought on the dark evidences of human error, which like dense and heavy clouds are rising, slowly it is true, but not less surely to heaven, to pour their after vengeance on our heads. If we heard but one instance, in imagination, the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle and no pride shut out, where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong that each day's life brings with it? So Dickens reminding us there that he wasn't terribly religious, although he was brought up Anglican, and he thought the church itself was very corrupt in a lot of ways. But I think this is more of a sort of humanist sort of sermon, if you like, to say, we can do a lot of harm to each other if we do it without thought and without kindness. So, of course, having heard this story, there's no doubt in anybody's minds that Oliver should not be made to suffer for this. And Losborne has hit on the idea, the doctor has hit on the idea of saying he's going to cast some doubt. He's hoping, we know that Brittles is not a fast boy. He was slow in going to fetch the doctor, physically slow, but the implication is also he's mentally slow. So Losborne is hoping that they catch on, because Losborne cannot, in good conscience, say to them, you have to lie. But Losborne is saying to them, are you sure this was the boy you shot? Are you sure about that? It's like My Cousin Vinny, isn't it? That final courtroom scene, are you sure about that 20 minutes? Are you sure? And Losborne is really doing that and saying, I'm not going to out and out commit a crime by getting you to lie, but I'm hoping you'll pick up on this idea that it was dark and it was confusing and there were you were scared and things were happening and perhaps you made a mistake. And he's just kind of warming up to this. And Brittles is not catching on. Giles is getting there. And all we have at this moment is the local constable. And we are just breathing a sigh of relief that the constable is going to say, all right, nothing to see here. There's nothing for me to do. Can't be certain. Case closed. I can go back and, have my dinner or what have you. And all of a sudden there's a knock at the door. And Brittle says, it's the runners, the Bow Street runners. They were the forerunner of the Metropolitan Police. And they were really the only detectives in the country at this time. Crime was investigated in a very haphazard manner, depending on your local constable. And now in London, they had started to collect a team together of people who took the investigation of crime, violent crime, particularly, more seriously. And they were known as the Bow Street Runners because that's just where they had their first headquarters. They were nearly at the end of their time here. The Metropolitan Police was about to come into being, and they had been around since the late 18th century. But here they are, and Brittles is relieved because Brittles is still not catching on, that nobody wants to turn on Oliver. And the doctor is aghast. Oh my goodness, these are serious men come to examine the crime. And the doctor is horrified because now he thinks he's in trouble, kind of thing. So please type in questions if you have any. I'm just going to keep on going through the books the chapters as we do, but I do want to talk particularly about this dream scene at the end, or whatever we think it is. Again, for Dickens readers, weekly installment, don't forget, we are breathing a sigh of relief. This is a roller coaster ride that poor Oliver has been on. He's in the workhouse and he goes to Sowerberry's and he escapes and he gets out of there and he falls in with Fagin and he's about to be, sent to prison by the magistrate, and then Mr. Brownlow takes him out of the way, and he's in the Brownlows' house, and everybody's loving him, and he's happy, and then he gets caught again by Sikes, and he gets shot, and that's kind of the lowest point so far, and now he looks to have been rescued, but all of a sudden here are these professional policemen who've come to investigate. So Donna says, I looked at the name Sikes and discovered that in Middle English, the words mean a slow-moving stream or a ditch. And of course, Oliver is discovered in a ditch. So yes, thank you very much. That is interesting. And also he's down in the ditch, isn't he? Amongst the dirty water. So thank you, Donna. And I love this. Dickens is having a little fun here with the blathers and duff. So one is blathering, and we find him blathering a lot in this chapter, and the other one is duff, which sounds like, if something's duff, it's useless and stupid. So instead of these two consummate professionals, we get blathers and duff. So I think he's having a little fun. And Dr. Losburn has to step very carefully here because he doesn't want to turn Oliver in, and he doesn't want to make a big deal out of this, but he recognizes that blathers and duff may not be that smart, but they're going to require a little more handling than the local constable. And we hear from Rose that she's very naive. Poor Rose says, well, if we just tell them the poor child's story, that will be sufficient to exonerate him. And the judge, the doctor says, well, no, probably not. And the truth of the matter, of course, is that no matter what prompted Oliver to do this, whatever fear for his life, whatever threats that Sikes had put him up to, Oliver is still guilty of this crime. Although these matters, if this were to happen in the modern day, it would never go to trial because nobody would prosecute this. But if for some bizarre reason it did get to trial, then these would be exonerating circumstances, and it just would end the case. But Oliver's not going to have probably a lawyer, and he's not going to have the benefit of somebody who believes that this child has been coerced in this way. And a lot of this is Dickens' point, is making that a lot of the people in the judiciary at this time are just going to say, well, of course he's evil, he's poor, he's, of course there's no helping him, he can't do anything else, he's too lazy to go to work, so he just robs other people. So there's no sense that anybody would necessarily give him any mercy. And Dickens is saying, well, this is the way our judicial system is. Dickens was railed against every institution, pretty much. The government for the poor law, the church, which he thought was corrupt in many ways. And we'll talk more about the judicial system at the end too. But what we are finding here is that, we can't rely on just honesty and the truth to save Oliver. Losberne knows that something else has to be done, something else has to be sort of finagled and managed. And, he basically gives the truth to Rosa, and she's very upset, saying, why did we have these people here? So Losberne keeps kind of stalling for time, giving them drinks, and we get this whole section here about conky chickweed, which is they're both blathering, and again, it doesn't advance our plot or anything very much, apart from it would have been terribly interesting for sort of very well-bred middle-class families to hear these, tales of criminals, however sanitized they are by Dickens, and chickweed and spires and so on and so forth. So it distracts us, and I think Dickens probably had a lot of fun writing this, and I think his readers, as I say, would have had a great deal of fun with this too. So it gets to the sort of the crux of how they're going to get out of this, and Mr. Losberne, Dr. Losberne, suggests to the officers essentially that Giles didn't shoot Oliver, that Oliver was trespassing in some just boyish hijinks, as you do, and I'm trying to find the exact spot here. Basically says that, Oliver stepped on, a tripwire on the property that set off a gun, a spring gun, accidentally wounded by a spring gun in some boyish trespass. And he came, not on this property, but somebody else's, and he came here for assistance this morning. And, nobody was shot here, nothing to see, back away. And Mr. Losberne does some sleight of hand behind the scenes by taking the shot out of Mr. Giles' gun. So when they examine Mr. Giles' gun, they find out it turned out to have no more destructive loading than gunpowder and brown paper. A discovery which made a considerable impression on everybody but the doctor, who'd drawn the ball about 10 minutes before he'd taken the shot out. So, this is the extent of Blathers and Duff's expertise, that it didn't occur to them that in the whatever time has now passed, 24, 48 hours since the robbery, that somebody could have removed the shot from the gun. So the next morning we hear that 2 men and a boy were in the cage at Kingston. This is just a temporary prison. And so Blathers and Duff go over to there to see if, this is their suspects. These are the people who broke into the house. And again, a little very sardonic sort of aside from Dickens, that the suspicious circumstances into the resolving themselves into the one fact that they've been discovered sleeping under a haystack, which, although a great crime, is only punishable by imprisonment, and is in the merciful eye of the English law and its comprehensible love of all the king's subjects held to be no satisfactory proof, in the absence of all other evidence, that the sleeper or sleepers have committed burglary accompanied with violence, and have therefore rendered themselves liable to the punishment of death. So again, Dickens is being particularly harsh in his criticism of the legal system, a system that would basically imprison people for vagrancy, for just sleeping under a haystack when they're homeless and trying to keep warm. And that, you know, anybody, even a small boy of Oliver's age, could be put to death for basically robbery with burglary with violence. In Old English, there were three different categories. Theft just meant taking something that didn't belong to you. To commit burglary, you had to do it in somebody's house. You had to, or somebody's premises. So if you, in common sort of modern day parlance, if you're walking through Starbucks and you pick up somebody else's wallet and get out of the way before they notice it's gone, that's theft. If you go into their house and take something out of their house, that's burglary. And if you do it with the threat of violence, then that's robbery. So robbery, burglary, and theft were actually three different things. And that would have been sort of fairly well known to Dickens readers too, that the crime you were accused of depended upon, you know, how and where it occurred. So going into somebody's house to commit burglary was a much more serious offense than theft, because again, you have this domestic ideal of the home. The Englishman's house is his castle, should be inviolate, nobody should be allowed to trespass, so on and so forth. Robbery with violence was kind of like being mugged on the street, and was probably a secondary offense, and then theft, the lesser offense of that. And those three things would have been very well known to Dickens readers as well, that burglary, entering somebody's house with an intent to take something, was far more serious than anything else, much more serious than the pickpocketing, where Oliver was threatened with imprisonment for taking supposedly Mr. Brownlow's wallet. So Oliver, you know, Mr. Losberne, eventually Giles sort of twigs on and basically says, I really can't be sure. I don't think I shot anybody. There's no ammunition in my gun. And, you know, Brittles is just like befuddled and bewildered by this, but Blathers and Duff realize there's nothing they can do here. And they're given a couple of guineas for their trouble. So, you know, that was a pretty good deal. Basically, they've essentially been bought off with, you know, Mrs. Maylie's good brandy and a couple of guineas. And, you know, we get this comic little aside that Blathers is still thinking that maybe the great criminal Conky Chickweed was the perpetrator of this crime after all. So we get a little strange chapter here, chapter 32, of the happy life Oliver began to lead with his kind friends. And Mrs. Maylie and Rose and Mr. Losberne all sort of decide to, you know, to look after him, to take him in. And again, you know, he's on the upswing of this roller coaster now, but he tells everybody that, you know, Mr. Brownlow and his servants took him in, and Oliver always regrets that Mr. Brownlow was left believing that Oliver was a thief and a bad un, as it were, and he wants to make reparations for that. So Losberne takes him in the carriage, and Oliver says, this is the house, and Losberne sets out and sort of barges in, and Oliver had given a very full description of this house, and this is the house where he was kept supposedly right before he was brought down to perpetrate this robbery. And we find, instead of Bill Sikes or any of his contemporaries being there, a little ugly humpbacked man opening the door. And Losberne goes in and looks around, and essentially there's no correlation between this house and the one Oliver has described. And this is shortly before this episode of Oliver telling us that he sees Fagin and monks right outside his window. And, at first it does put some doubt into Losberne's mind about the veracity of this boy. But it also sets up a potential thought in our minds that Oliver is dreaming, imagining things, and so on and so forth. We'll get to that in the next chapter or so, but Losberne sort of backs out of this house with the humpback man and basically sort of says to himself, well, I'm the idiot. What was I thinking about? I could have gone in there and there could have been like 10 men with guns. And then they do find the right house, and there's nobody there. There's a to let sign in the window. And they go to next door and say, where's Mr. Brownlow? And they ask the servant next door, and the servant goes to inquire, and she comes back and she says, Mr. Brownlow had sold off his goods and gone to the West Indies 6 weeks before. So, and the housekeeper's gone and everybody else. So Oliver can't reconcile with Mr. Brownlow, but this has at least confirmed for Losberne that Oliver was telling the truth, because Oliver had taken him to the right house and knew the names and everything else. And Oliver says to Dr. Losberne, take me to the bookseller. I know where he is. And Losberne's like, enough for one day. I'm not going there. So we're left with this peculiar thing about the wrong house, and we'll kind of deal with that later in a way. But Mrs. Maylie and Rose go down to the country in the warm months. And we have this bucolic, idyllic life throughout that chapter, with, Oliver is being taught to read and write by a kindly old gentleman. They go to church. They have good food. Dickens is contrasting. He says a couple of times in these chapters about how clean the poor people were in the country. And of course, poverty in the country was no less severe than it was in the towns. But, there was generally a bit more air and a bit more light, and perhaps therefore a bit more tolerable. Poverty in the country was and employment in the country was much more seasonal. So with Oliver arriving there in summer, he's liable to find that people very gainfully employed in farming and not so much evidence. But we notice as well that Mrs. Maylie and Rose, very charitable ladies, and they take aid to the poor people. So again, this is kind of like outdoor aid, the very thing that the Poor Law said it was going to end by having these workhouses. We find that with good people in small areas, though charity was still very much available. Of course, it's, again, just the luck of the draw if you happen to be in a neighborhood where there's a benevolent, wealthier family and a good church, or whether you're abandoned in much the same manner or sent into a workhouse. But it is a contrast to the way that Mrs. Maylie and Rose take things to the poor people, is a big contrast to the way that they're treated in the towns. So chapter 33 Oliver and his friends experiences a sudden check in his happiness. And this is Rose. Rose becomes very ill, and she has a fever. Oliver's previously had fevers, and they could be life-threatening because medicine was still very much in its infancy. And Mrs. Maylie says to Oliver, "You've got to go to Chertsey, and you've got to send this letter. And we've got to get Mr. Losburn here. Dr. Losburn needs to come here." And so Oliver does. He takes the letter, and he's leaving the inn. He has to take the letter to the inn because it was going to be sent by horse and carriage, and that's where the carriages were kept. And he accidentally stumbles into a tall man, Oliver, wrapped in a cloak, who was that moment coming out of the inn door. And, Oliver says, "I'm sorry for bumping into you." And the man responds with death. Who would have thought of it? Grind him to ashes. And he's being particularly wild and peculiar, and Oliver's really startled by this. And this strange man advances upon Oliver to grab hold of him. But at the same time, he fell violently on the ground, writhing and foaming in a fit. So he's having an epileptic fit at this point. Again, medicine was still in its infancy. There were a lot of people who realized that epilepsy was a disease that could not be helped. And there are a lot of people who thought it was a punishment from God for being evil and wicked. So choose your what Dickens intended here yourself, but it's either a convenient plot device to stop this man getting his hands on Oliver, or a comment on his wickedness. Oliver, being a good boy, makes sure that the man gets help, and then he runs away. And we find out that Losburn's on his way. We see, by the way, in passing, Oliver has to go past a funeral of a young mother to see this. And these images remain with us, makes Oliver think of his own mother. And we're going to learn a little bit more about Rose too. So chapter 34 contains some introductory particulars relative to a young gentleman who now arrives on the scene. And this is the chapter where Oliver has this strange dream. So first of all, we learn that this young man, Harry, is Mrs. Maylie's son. And Mrs. Maylie has finally sent for Harry and told him that Rose is maybe dying. And Harry's question to her is, "Why didn't you tell me before? I'm in love with her. This is, the woman I want to marry." And Mrs. Maylie says, "Well, I'm kind of in two minds about it, essentially because Mrs. Maylie has grave reservations about Harry marrying Rose." And we may think that this is because Rose perhaps is penniless, or that there's something about this Mrs. Maylie is not particularly approving of. But we find out the actual truth is Mrs. Maylie's a little bit distrustful of her son Harry, not Rose. And Rose does recover and talks about there being a stain on her background. And I think we can intimate that the stain is that she's illegitimate. And this is why Mrs. Maylie she's Mrs. Maylie's niece, that, Mrs. Maylie's sister, Mrs. Maylie obviously has been married. She was married at some point, but that Mrs. Maylie's sister had this child out of wedlock. So there's a couple of things here. One is, the comparison with Oliver's mother, Oliver's mother gave birth to Oliver out of wedlock too, and died in childbirth, essentially. and we don't know exactly what happened to Rose's mother, but there's now this parallel connection between Rose and Oliver. And Mrs. Maylie is a little bit mistrustful of Harry, not Rose. Mrs. Maylie knows that, you know, Rose is this angel. But she says to Harry, you're very ambitious. And if you are not careful, you know, this could be brought up against you. And I don't want you to resent this later on. And I don't want you to turn against Rose if you marry her. And Harry is, you know, declaring, no, everything's going to be, everything's going to be hunky-dory. I love Rose. And eventually, Harry does propose to Rose, and Rose says, you know, no, I have this stain. I can't marry you because you're going to regret it. It's going to be brought up. It's going to hinder you. And I think, again, we've got to think about this. Dickens has given us this portrait of basically what is an angel on earth. Who would not want to marry Rose at this point? I mean, even I would marry Rose at this point. And she's, you know, wonderful and gorgeous and everything. But because of this thing that is not her fault, she had no say in this. She thinks she's going to be a drag on Harry's career. So Harry says, you know, I'll leave it for a year, I think, and then I'll come back and ask you again. And after that, if you still say no, then I'll never mention it again. So we're left with that. The introduction of these characters in this, you know, so little love problem at this moment, I think, can only be designed to show, you know, just how cruel society can be. Because you know, we know that neither Oliver nor Rose had any say in their parentage, and yet they are the ones who are suffering for the sins of their mother, not their father. And, you know, it's being perpetuated here. So then we have this sleep, which is not a sleep, and Oliver says that he thinks that the Jew and the man who accosted him outside the inn are outside the window. Now, my copy of the book does not have an illustration of it, but this is the illustration that was in the original book. And John Sutherland asks the question here, is Oliver dreaming? And Oliver hears them speak. He hears them sort of identify him. And Oliver, you know, kind of comes to, wakes up and starts shouting, the Jew, the Jew. And the next chapter, the final chapter I asked you to read for today, is really taken up with Oliver and Giles and Harry all looking around and not seeing any trace of these visitors, as well as the final conversation between Harry and Rose. But what I want to turn to here is, you know, was this real? Did Oliver see this? And this essay by John Sutherland says, well, you know, maybe it was a dream, because he says they make inquiries at the alehouse and nobody has seen Monks and Fagin. And John Sutherland makes the point, the appearance of two such low-life aliens would surely have attracted the notice of suspicious locals. And nobody claims to have seen them, and there's no trace of them on the ground. There's no flattened grass where they would have stood. So was it a dream? Was it real? Was it not? A number of explanations have been put forward. That Dickens was less careful in writing the novel than we are in reading it is the most primitive. A critic, Humphrey House, who wrote about this in the 20th century, says that it was Dickens' first attempt at a novel proper. The sequence of external events which befall Oliver are complicated and careless. And he notices, and he lines it up with this moment when Monks thinks he sees the shadow of a woman crossing the wainscot. So, you know, he's basically saying that, you know, Dickens was careless in just saying that they were there. How did they know where Oliver was? How could they leave no trace? How could two grown men have just disappeared unless it was a dream? Sutherland goes on to talk about the fact that Dickens got very interested in mesmerism. And an author, Fred Kaplan, who wrote about this in 1975, Kaplan notes that Oliver Twist was written at the height of the mesmeric mania, when Dickens was closely associated with the arch apostle of this new science. And he basically talks about mesmerism as Dickens would have understood it at this time to be a kind of way of like time traveling, that Oliver could be somewhere else. Basically a clairvoyance, that he could imagine these people there and he could see what they were doing even when he wasn't there. By the time Dickens went through and published this novel in new formats in later years, he re-edited and sort of revived this later on. This science had been completely debunked. So Sutherland posits the idea that maybe, you know, Dickens did not draw his attention in prefaces to further editions of this novel to this science because it had been debunked and he was embarrassed about having put it in. The other potential reason for this is that Dickens had to ask his illustrator, you know, sometime in advance to prepare the illustrations for this book. And there's another theory that Dickens asked the illustrator to do this drawing of little Oliver in this country retreat with monks and the Jew outside. And that once he got that, he had to sort of write around it to make it plausible. But it doesn't kind of really hang together. If it's a dream, it sort of does. If they were really there, then these two elderly men could not have, you know, got out of the way without somebody seeing them or somebody noticing them or leaving some trace. And we now know that the clairvoyance is nonsense, and Dickens was sort of taken in by this idea that Oliver could conjure these people mentally from somewhere else. So I see there are questions. One's just a comment. Thank you, Kathy. And yes, Jane, I will remind you about the winter and spring terms. Thank you. Kathy also asks, is the dream sequence designed to scare the reader somewhere like the scary foreshadowing scenes in horror movies? Absolutely, I think so. I think, you know, we can talk about how real it is. It must be preying on Oliver's mind to a huge deal. That, you know, he's had this sort of love and security once before with Mr. Brownlow, and it was cruelly taken away. And I think a more modern explanation would be, you know, this is a dream that seems so real to Oliver because he's in fear once more of being taken back somehow by Nancy or Sykes, or you know, put back into the clutches of these men. And the fact that he's had this experience with monks in Chertsey, where he saw monks fall down and have an epileptic fit, which must have been very startling for a little boy. And he must have this on his mind. But absolutely, I think he's thinking, you know, are they going to catch up with me again? Donna says, Oliver recovers in the country as well his rescuers are members of the upper class. Is Dickens making a statement here about the poor and how they can or will survive at this time? Yes, I think so. And I think, you know, the fact that they're there in the summertime when it's nice and warm and everybody probably has full employment, and maybe also a comment about the fact that the middle class would go back into London for the winter time and would not see rural poverty to be as much of a problem, because when they're there in the warm months, the poor people are fully employed. They're farming and they're bringing in the harvest. When the poor are really struggling, when they don't have food, and the fact that their houses may be a bit cleaner and a bit roomier than London is no help if you don't have anything to eat. And the middle classes don't see that because they've gone back to London when things start getting rough for the poor people in the country. So I will pause if anybody's got a hand up or a further question. And while you're either typing that in or putting your hands up, Jane asked me to remind you what I'm doing for winter and spring. Winter is Madame Bovary, and I will be reading the Lydia Davis translation. You can pick any translation that you want or that you currently have. In spring, I'm doing 2 classes. One is a survey course on Victorian literature, talking about some of the social history. And there's no prior reading for that. I will give you some excerpts each week by email, but you don't have to read them in advance. And the other class I'm doing in spring is Anna Karenina. And I will be reading the Pavir Volokhansky translation. But again, you can read whatever translation you like or you have in your house. And I will, if you need further information about that, I'm happy to send it to you by email. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I don't know if anybody's got a hand raised.
I don't see any raised hands.
Okay, thank you, Meg. So next week, the 28th of October, read chapters 36 to 45. And I think we know by how much of the book we have left that we are not quite at Oliver's happy ending just yet. So we're going to find out what else could possibly happen to this poor little boy that Dickens can throw at him from now. But yes, I think he's right to be a little worried at this time, as Kathy points out, and the reader is correct to be a little worried too, that just when he thought he was safe, once more, he's going to be in danger. We need that. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Meg, and I will see you next week.